Hello everyone, Scarabray here, and I wanted to talk about Knight Errants. And so the Knight Errant is basically a sort of literary trope from the Middle Ages, where you would have a heroic knight, typically the main character of the story, or if not him, then an important side character, or just a side character the story wanted to focus on. And they would basically go around on a journey to fight evil, like dragons, monsters, and evil knights. And a lot of the evil knights were presumably Knight Errants too, except they were Knight Errants for the side of evil, rather than the main character, who of course being, well, main character would be on the side of good. Now, what I'm talking about here is, or rather what I want to talk about, is the historical inspiration for a Knight Errant. So, Knight Errant, the term itself, basically means a knight who is wandering around. And the question is, did knights wander around? Well, obviously they did. Like, there were times when knights did wander around. However, a lot of these cases weren't necessarily cases where... Now, there's a case where it was mostly exclusive to knights, but not all of them were. So, to give examples, a knight might wander around because they're on a pilgrimage, which isn't exclusive to knights. Like, commoners went on pilgrimages all the time, too, as did nobles in times when nobles didn't really have... as did nobles when times when knights weren't necessarily... weren't all knights. Like, there were times in the Middle Ages when every noble was considered a knight, but there were also times when knighthood was a very specific thing that not all nobles were part of. Like, it also, location would have also played a role, but to put it in simple terms, knights did wander around, like pilgrimages, also for the things like fighting for their lord, like going to war would involve wandering. But, like, once again, that wasn't alone. Knights who were doing pilgrimages or at war would have been with a large group, and Knight Errants in literary tradition typically only had a few servants with them at most. Which, once again, is probably at least partially an exaggeration for the sake of making the story more fun and interesting and exciting, because travel in the Middle Ages could be dangerous. Like, you could run into dangerous wildlife, you could run into, say, aside from dangerous wildlife, you could run into people who were trying to kill you, like bandits. And keep in mind that bandits did include sometimes former mercenaries. Like, in fact, a lot of bandits were former mercenaries. There were even minor nobles, and, there were even times when nobles and knights were among bandits. So, yeah, to put it in simple terms, there were terms... You could, as a knight, if you were fighting a bandit, you could end up fighting someone who was on your level or just as good as you are, or at the very least has similar training to you. Like, not something you want to be caught at alone. So, aside from that, what other reasons would a knight have to potentially wander around? So, well, I mean, that's the first part of the Knight Errant thing. What about the knights who are fighting evil, or in the case of the antagonistic Knight Errants, the knights fighting for evil? Well, once again, I suppose that you could consider... just this thing. Excessive raiding and pillaging a form of evil. Okay, so... excessive raiding and pillaging could easily be considered a form of evil, and there were knights who did that, but there were also commoners who did that. Things like raiding and pillaging were stuff that armies did at the time, and they all did them. It wasn't like just knights did them. Common foot soldiers did. Like, previous times, Roman soldiers did. Like, I'll probably make a video on this, but seeing an army to a general person would have been pretty horrifying. Because even an army on your side was at the very least going to take a lot of food from you. And, that was not necessarily a situation you'd want to be in, for obvious reasons. And an enemy army would probably do far worse than that. Oh, your own army, like, there's a chance that your own army might do far worse than that, too. Save here with 9 to save. Okay, but anyway, so... But generally speaking, it was better to see your army, like an army allied with you, than an enemy army, but it still would have been terrifying to see even your own guys. And to see an enemy army, that would have been, like, potentially a very horrifying sight. Sight for, like, fairly obvious reasons, but... Yeah, even seeing your own guys would have been a pretty horrifying sight for many commoners, regardless of the era. Like, even in the, I'll talk more about this in our videos, but even as late as the American Civil War, you had both the Union and Confederate armies pillaging their own lands. Like, as ways of getting food. It wasn't something that was exclusive to one warrior caste. Now, as for fighting for good, well, there are a few causes that medieval people would have considered a form of fighting for good. Among them are... like, fighting to protect pilgrims, for example. And there were knights who did that. Like the Knights Templar and other chivalrous orders of holy knights. And the Knights Templar, Knights Templar and other chivalrous orders of holy knights did this. But once again, this wasn't the thing they do alone, and likewise with the knights who were bandits, they wouldn't have done that alone either. Being a bandit is a pretty dangerous career because a lot of people want you dead for very obvious reasons. So, you're not going to do it alone. And if you're and there also were knights who worked, and once again, pilgrims would have been alone for obvious reasons either, because protecting people is a multi-person job. But as another note, if you were a knight who was going after bandits, because there were knights who worked in law enforcement, and would have been tasked with things like fighting bandits. But if you were a knight who was going after bandits, you wouldn't have done that alone either. Like I said earlier, a lot of bandits were trained soldiers. And a lot of them were, well, at least some of them were nobles and knights. So, you're not going to go after them alone, and knights would have had guys working under them. Like, think about it this way, if you're a cop and you have to do a drug bust, are you going to go in there and challenge them to single combat? No, you're going to get a bunch of other cops, possibly some higher backup, and then just go in there and beat the living crap out of the drug dealers with as many guys as you can get. So, yeah, basically the bandits, the knights didn't fight bandits alone. Now, there is a situation where I think knights were alone, or at least partially alone, that I think fits the Knight Errant thing most well, and that was with various knights who were essentially ronin. And this is where I think the main inspiration for Knight Errants comes in, as well as their glorification, because they are really one of the big glorified parts of it, which I'll get into in a moment. But basically, I think that the Knight Errants were inspired by knights who didn't have jobs. So, there were knights who were like ronin, like, who didn't have masters or lords to go back to, and these knights would go to various places like tournaments, and in addition to tournaments, they'd go to stuff like, for example, the like, battles, but they did a lot of tournaments, they did some battles in the hopes of getting the attention of a feudal lord. And when they did get the, well, yeah, so these knights, I think, would have often not been wealthy enough to afford servants, because, once again, they don't have a job. So they don't have a lord to serve, so not wealthy enough to have servants, so they could have very much often been alone, or at least almost alone, if they could have servants, but not that many. Like, I don't know the exact statistics of how many of them couldn't afford servants versus how many of them could. Don't even know if the statistics are known. But these knights would have gone a lot. Oh. But these knights would have, for the most part, been like traveling around, doing stuff, going all over the place, stuff like that. So, and now then comes the, sorry, for Knight Errants myth, like if the guy's going around doing stuff like that. Now, you might ask, okay then, if these guys are Knights Errants, then where does the glorification come from? Because it sounds like these are guys who were just looking for a job. And I agree. So, my question, so, here's where I think it comes from, like the knight errant idea of the glorification. Tourney knights. Because, here's a simple fact. Tourney knights were really popular. They were basically sports stars. Like, it depends on the era, but being a knight was basically a weird mixture of being a politician, a professional soldier, a police officer, and a sports star. Like, though once again, this varied depending on the era. And as a knight, and tourney knights, well, once again, sports stars are popular today, and tourney knights were popular as well. People would do a lot of debating of who the greatest tourney knight of all time was, of who would beat who in a fight. Like, would William Marshall, for example, beat this other guy? And I think that because of this, tourney knights did end up getting glorified in the knight errant myth. Which, I'm not entirely a myth, since, once again, various elements of knights were there, and it might be a combination, but yeah, basically I think that tourney knights were glorified, ultimately. He is part of the wait. Yeah, I think that tourney knights were glorified. Because, once again, they were pretty popular, and when people made the knight errant stories, they wanted to tell them about that. So, yeah. And that, yeah, so I think that's why I had to say that basically glorified tourney knights. Though, once again, knight errants do often work for a lord, like, pretty much all the knights of the Round Table were depicted as knight errants, and they worked for King Arthur. But it could also be that the tourney knight thing is a compilation of multiple knightly elements, because, like I said, there were some villainous knights out there who would do things like banditry. There were some knights who went around doing things like protecting pilgrims, like holy knights. And yeah, there were different knights who did stuff like protecting things like holy knights. So it could be, and there were knights who, and lots of knights who were in tournaments did have lords. They just did the tournament thing as training or to make extra money, or because they enjoyed it. So yeah, like it could be a tourney that knight errants were a compilation of multiple things knights did while traveling around. Could be that they were more strict, but well, yeah, that's my opinion. So anyway, thanks for watching. Thank you for watching, everyone, and remember to like, comment, and subscribe.